Conversations across time. 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 Conversations across time.
Hi, I'm Vivienne Crawford, and welcome to another episode of Conversations Across Time, the TV show that allows you, the viewer, to participate in imaginary conversations between people from different time periods and imagine what it is that they would say if they had an opportunity to talk to each other. In the course of history, there are certain individuals who have shaped the way that we now think, and they've also led to political movements that might have come about as a result of civil unrest. Tonight we have with us two immortals from another time period visiting with us. And I'd like to start with, first, seated to my right is my co-host and friend, former state representative Babette Josephs. Welcome, Babette.
My pleasure.
Seated next to Representative Babette is Governor George Wallace. Welcome, Governor Wallace.
Good evening, ma'am.
Seated next to Governor Wallace is Mary Chestnut. Mary Chestnut is the Civil War's most preeminent diarist. She was also married to a senator from South Carolina, and as you know, South Carolina was the first state to proclaim secession from the Union. So Mary Chestnut comes as a member of the Southern plantation aristocracy. Welcome, Mrs. Chestnut.
It's so good to be back with you, Ms. Crawford.
And I'm welcoming you back because there is so much, when last we met, I said we have so much more to talk about. So I'm going to recite to the panel one of my favorite poems, the first stanza only from one of my favorite poems, and it will let the audience know what it is we're going to talk about today. And the stanza is from a poem written by Rudyard Kipling in 1898. And it's simply this. It's called The Female of the Species. I love this because it talks about women and the power of women. When the Himalayan peasant meets the he-bear in his pride, he will shout to scare the monster, who will often turn aside. But the female thus accosted rends the peasant tooth and nail, for the female of the species is more deadly than the male. Now, the audience will be somewhat surprised by something that, in research for this show, our historian Charles Hammack and I have had this delightful conversation about this. And that is, in 1863, Southern white women led food riots throughout the South. They were the wives, the daughters, the sisters of men who were conscripted to fight in the Civil War. Now, what's interesting about this has to do with class, because these women were the wives of soldiers, and they were poor, they were of working class, they had small farms. There was, and this is something that I find particularly interesting, there was something called the 20 Negro rule. The 20 Negro rule simply meant that if you were a slaveholder and you owned more than 20 slaves or more, you were exempt from serving in the war. What that means is that you are going to have men who come from limited financial backgrounds, farmers with small farms, who are fighting the war. Now, we all know that one of the things that the Civil War was fought for was to preserve the institution of slavery. So you have the very people who are going to benefit from the war exempted from fighting. And you have their less fortunate neighbors, and when I say fortunate, because the owner, if you owned a slave, you were wealthy. And you know, we all have this gone with the wind notion about these plantations with lots of slaves, but most farms had less than 10 slaves. If you owned 20 slaves, that was property, and you were a person with money and with means. So given that, I think the backdrop of the food wars that happened in 1863 is something that we should be talking about. And that is that there were, as we have now, people that speculated and who made money from the war. And these Southern women sort of thought that there was a contract, there should be a contract between themselves and the government, whereby if their mates and their sons and their husbands and their fathers were off fighting the war, that the government would necessarily provide that they would be able to eat. Well, that didn't happen. There were food speculators who actually hoarded foodstuffs, and these women didn't have food for their children. Now, I started out with that poem by Rudyard Kipling because it talks about the fact that we as females are the most deadly sex. And why is that? Because we're charged with taking care of the children. We're charged with feeding the family. That's supposedly our job. Consequently, if you have women who are unable to feed their children and provide for their homes because they don't have the wherewithal to farm their lands, they are left shouldering the plows and keeping a farm going. Anyone knows a farm is a small enterprise and it requires labor. And if you take away a good part of the labor force to have to fight your war, you should make some provisions for those women. So in 1863, there was a riot in Atlanta, and it spread because these women were very organized. And that was one of the things that was so interesting about this, because when they talked about these women taking over the food convoys, they would say, well, she was a muscular woman. They had to have some excuse. But these were women that were farm women. These were women that were what my father would call corn-fed. These were women who were strong because they were used to doing the work of running a farm, and consequently they were dangerous. And so what you have is the food riots that happened in 1863 that changed the social fabric of the South. Now, probably the most notorious food riot happened in Richmond on April 2nd, 1863. 300 women marched to the governor's mansion, and they were orderly, they were very quiet, but
they were silent.
Yes.
They were silent. They barely spoke a word.
That's right.
And the governor wouldn't see them.
The governor refused to see them.
We have a governor like that right now, actually. Things do not change.
That's right. That's right. Things do not change. And what you see is, I don't even understand how these men thought that these women were a joke. And they quickly learned that they were not, because these women could shoot. And so I think in the Richmond riot, and of course you lived in Richmond at the time that this was going on, Miss Chestnut. And during the Richmond riot, finally I think President Jefferson Davis came out, threw some coins at the women, and told them to disperse. I guess I want us to talk about what happens when the men are off fighting a war and the women are left to on their own devices.
Well, if you're, as you were saying, if your entire life, and this is what women were taught and still are taught,
yes,
is to make sure you can feed your family, take care of your family, take care of your children, raise your children, and you can't do it because there's no food, then you react very, very strongly. And we saw this in the food riots, not only in the South. There have been food riots forever. We remember one in the French Revolution.
Yes.
That was women.
Yes.
Yes. If you don't mind my saying so, Ms. Babette, I concur with Ms. Chestnut and Ms. Crawford. As in my political career, up to my becoming governor of Alabama, I have failed to appreciate the value and competence of women. Like in my own experience.
Oh my, this is going to be fun.
If I may, excuse me.
Yes, ma'am.
Since we are talking about 1863, I would like to just say I was there.
Yes.
I saw, I felt, the thing with women is that we are, just as Kipling said, we are very, 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 very strong. We are who we are, and we will not ever let go. These women silently walked down those streets, and they had over 1,000 people behind them, the men and the children that did not go to war behind them. They were armed with everything you can imagine.
Tell us about some of the kinds of weapons that they had, please.
They had guns, they had Bowie knives, they had just rocks, they had everything.
But they had pitchforks.
They had pitchforks.
And hatchets.
Of course, they were farmers.
Yes.
They were plantation owners or workers or,
They were tough.
They were women.
Right.
Whether they were tough women or just women, by the very nature of our souls, we bear children. Now, I did not bear a child, sadly. But I saw many who have, and I know that it's an innate response in my own self to absolutely take care of your young. Now, I admit, being born and raised in the aristocracy that I was raised in, I have shame about that. But I changed my ways, and I wrote about it so the truth would be spoken clearly and people would know what really happened and who these women were and how atrocious the men were of that day.
But they learned. After they had guns, brandishes.
They did learn, and within days.
And after one city after another, I mean, we're talking about Richmond, but there were one city after another.
Within days, the government came up with the foods to feed these people. And they were afraid. The government was afraid.
I want to talk about...
As they should have been.
Absolutely.
And I want to talk about initially when these food riots happened. Because it's my understanding at the first food riot, which took place in Atlanta, that the shopkeeper, because I think they marched
down the streets where the merchants were, yes.
And one merchant sort of poo-pooed them as though, well, they're not important, doesn't mean anything. And one woman, who was apparently the leader of the group, jumped up on the counter, pulled a gun, put a gun to his head, and while she held the gun to his head, her fellow sisters who were marching with her actually took all the supplies in this man's store, this shopkeeper's store.
And that news traveled quickly.
And I see Governor Wallace wincing.
Yes.
And
madam,
so,
I did.
Well, I mean, what's interesting to me, Governor Wallace, is you were not from this aristocratic background. It would seem to me that you would have had some understanding of what was going on, but you're wincing. Tell us why.
Well, I agree with you, Ms. Crawford, Ms. Josephs, and Ms. Chestnut. It is true that I am not of the traditional aristocracy, as you call it. However, I come from a political background that favored this aristocracy. In my political career, I have used race baiting, as you call it now, to divert the men's attention from their immediate issues. I had given them, I regret to say that I have given them a false sense of security by false notions of racial superiority.
I want to say, and we're going to take a break. But after the break, I'd like to come back because I want to challenge that, because we're not just talking about racial superiority. The first time you were here, we jumped on you about race. We're not talking about racial superiority. We're now talking about sexual superiority. That for some reason, that the testosterone tells you that men are more to be feared and more to be respected than women. So think about that. We're going to come back and have a conversation, because you're now talking about over 50% of the population.
Yes, ma'am.
Ambition.
Yes, ambition. That's what it is. And so we will be back. Please stay tuned. And when we come back, well, we'll just find out what Governor Wallace has to say about these poor little women trying to feed their children. Thank you.
Conversations across time, conversations across time, conversations across time, conversations across time, conversations across time.
Are you accusing me of taking advantage?
I'm accusing you of raping her repeatedly. That's what I'm accusing you of. She had no way to say no.
Conversations across time, conversations across time, conversations across.
So right before the break, we were actually talking to Governor Wallace, and I felt very strongly that what he was indicating was there was sexual superiority of males. Now, I know and I take into account, Governor Wallace, that you were, through most of your political career, a populist. So, you know, I know that on some level you had a certain amount of respect for the issue that these women were talking about. Yet, the idea of sexual superiority of males is something that we just want to explore a little more, because that's what it seems like you're saying.
What I was truly indicating, madam, was that I was brought up in a society where certain persons had their position in life and they maintained that position, and such as the black people in my society were allotted their positions. So in my society, females had their position, and it was not particularly becoming of females to step out of that position, as these women who rioted in Richmond and other cities did during the War of Southern Independence.
It was a matter of life and death for their children, sir. Unbecoming.
Well, yeah, it doesn't matter whether they looked cute or not.
My
I mean,
good
they were
Lord.
starving, which you should have sympathy for, coming from the poor people that you came from yourself.
Or does your sexism override your common sense?
As you may well aware, madam, in the society I was brought up in, the Caucasian males were expected to maintain certain attitudes. Like during my high school days, I was a champion boxer, and I was expected to maintain a level of masculinity, and that was expected of men of my culture, and
Of course, in this century, we have women boxing.
yes, I am familiar with that, ma'am. But like I have stated, such behavior, which was expected of men and supposedly respected of men, but coming from females was not considered proper, and that was simply the culture I was brought up in, madam.
So do you think that were you so conditioned that you believed that women had to do nothing except what was proper? What if they were hungry?
Or becoming?
Yes, proper or becoming.
I see your point, ladies. However, such was the culture I was brought up in, and that was what the men in the army of the Confederacy was fighting for during the War of Southern
But the men
Independence.
retreated right away, really, as soon as these riots broke out in all of the cities, or many of the cities, a lot of the big cities of the South.
How do you reconcile that the governor of the the president of the Confederacy came out and threw coins to these starving women? I don't know how to help you. It's these northerners, these Yankee infiltrators that are coming in here and creating the problems. But here's the money I have, and he threw coins at the women.
I've heard of that incident, madam, and I'm sure Mr. Davis did what he had to do in order to attract their attention and
Well, he can't be held responsible for that.
No, and I'm not holding him responsible. I guess what I'm trying to understand is, because I view you, knowing your history as a populist, I would think that you would be someone who would champion these women, because they were, in essence, trying to provide for their children. They were trying to feed their families. And not just female children, they were male children. And I mean, I know that the Confederacy conscripted anyone, I guess by the time they were 12 years old, they were deemed that they needed to go fight this war. But this was a war that was for the aristocracy of the South. It was not for your forefathers.
That is true, madam. But in my political career, I have worked to divert people's attention from the true issues. In my administration as governor of Alabama, Alabama ranked very low in certain social indicators like quality of education and quality of health care,
transportation,
sanitation,
everything.
health care,
food.
But the main vehicle,
She shakes her head.
And the main vehicle of my career was instigating and agitating people's fears around race. And it is
Brilliant.
Yes, and it is for that I am deeply ashamed.
Yeah, but it's, I mean, we're still doing it. And certainly there are politicians today that took lessons from you and understand that the way they get power is to divert all the interest away from themselves and to some other problem. But back to the women. The women wrought huge changes, though.
Yes, they did.
These men were, I think, completely dumbfounded. They did not expect to have a woman hold a pistol to their heads, much more effective than a man. Maybe that's why we're the most dangerous, because people do not expect.
But we should be known for who we are. I
Yes.
mean, we are women, and we are the bearer of children. You come from us, sir.
I do appreciate that.
What I would like to
Not
say,
enough.
what I
Trust
would
me.
like to say or add to the conversation is this: that was the beginning. These food wars
Yes.
were the beginning
Of the social
women, absolute
social safety net.
change that
That's
was
right.
so necessary.
And
Right,
I,
which made local governments, state governments, rather than local governments, state governments now
local.
became, but it all had been local.
And see, that
it
was just it.
transferred to the state the burden of making sure, or the pleasure of making sure, that none of the citizens were starving.
Now, the thing that is most interesting about this has been, there is a scholar at the University of Pennsylvania who has written a book talking about this whole notion of the subsistence crisis. The subsistence crisis that these women experienced is what led to so many changes in terms of there being the establishment of a social safety network. And that came out of this movement in the South, which, you know, no one talks about it. It gets swept under the rug. But these women, these poor women, and they were joined by members of the aristocracy, because these women realized how that all of a sudden they had power. And what do we have happen? After the Civil War, starts the emergence of the suffragette movement. And you know what? It's because these women realized, wait a minute, we've got some power. Now that we have brought about these changes in the social safety network, now it's time to harness our power and do some other things. And we're going to talk about that, because
there was the power, but there was also the realization among many women that they were treated almost as badly as African Americans,
as the slaves had been
would
treated.
say now, as the slaves, that they were property of these white men.
They absolutely were.
In the same way as
Absolutely.
slaves were. And that's why the
Not
modern...
in the same way. Not in the same way, but very close. Too close
But
to
I
come.
want to say this,
Yes.
what's
There was a
interesting.
parallel there.
Yes. Absolutely.
It was power, and that was one of the things that Mrs. Chestnut, that we owe you at least I feel as an African American, it's important to acknowledge that. And that is that you started from the very beginning when you started with your diary,
Yes.
talking about the hypocrisy of these Southern aristocrats, the men who modeled themselves as gentlemen and honor and all these wonderful things, and at the same time, after dinner, they tiptoed down to the slave, or not tiptoed, they walked with no shame.
They walked with their dignity down
Exactly.
to those slaves, and they had their way with children, not just the women.
Yes.
They had their way with children.
Anybody.
I have heard.
They owned
Anybody.
them. They owned them.
owned them.
They own them.
But
And they could
then,
say,
not only did this safety net kind of idea start to evolve, and the suffragists, but all throughout the history as we move forward from that, you see women all over the country making an enormous fuss over child labor,
yes.
over exploiting women's labor.
Even in the military. It's
Yes.
now, they're now talking about the fact that women and how women are mistreated, not just women, but these men of power, these officers, and these lord their power over not just women, but men.
Yes.
It's human nature. Sadly, it's human nature.
And the
Well,
indignities
human
that they
nature
suffer.
to not put up with it too.
Absolutely. Well, it depends on the quality of your spirit.
Yes, and one would hope that women would have lots of spirit.
I think women have a lot of spirit. Not all are good, but most are.
Aren't we at least now, Babette, aren't you and I sitting here thinking that we owe a debt to these Southern women?
Oh, definitely.
to these Southern women. I mean, I can envision.
We stand on the shoulders of all
Yes.
the mothers who came before us.
Yes, yes.
Who fought against child labor, who fought for the right to vote,
Yes.
who fought for peace.
Yes.
The person who voted against getting into the First World War was a woman
Yes.
in the House of Representatives in Washington. She wouldn't do it. Good for her.
And I think what we see and what we're experiencing today, and I know that, you know, this always happens close to the end of a program, but what I want to invite you back to talk about has to do with the parallels with today, because I personally think that we are headed down a very slippery slope. And we need to talk about the Farm Bill, and we need to talk about the fact that we want to subsidize these huge farmers,
Well,
and at the same
20
time,
slaves, right?
and that's exactly what has happened. So what we'll do is I want to have you come back, because we can see how this has so many parallels in what's going on today, even with the wars. So again, we always wind up having me saying, please come back so that we can take up this conversation. So I'm going to invite you back if you have an opportunity. I'd like us to discuss just the parallels between what was going on then and what is going on now, because we see that poor people are close to starving again, and we need to talk about that. So I thank you for joining us. We always seem to get up against the time clock, but I want you to please come back and join us when we'll take up this conversation. My guests have agreed they will come back. And I thank you so much, Mrs. Chestnut. I thank you, Governor Wallace. And Babette, I'm always happy that you're here. And this has been Conversations Across Time. We will bring these people back, these interesting panelists back, and we will have more of a discussion about the parallels between what happened in the Civil War and what is going on today. Thank you. I am Vivienne Crawford saying welcome, and please come back to Conversations Across Time. Thank you.
Conversations across time. 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 across time. Conversations across time. Conversations across time.